going to take about 25 to 30 minutes to talk to you about this story of Lady Bird Johnson. And I want, before I start sharing some of the visuals that I've brought, to just give you a little bit of background on how I came to write this book, because it'll help, I think, you understand what I'm going to tell you about the story itself. But first, I actually want to ask, without appearing ageist at all, how many people here were living in Washington in the 1960s? Excellent. Oh, that's fantastic. Okay. So partially this is a Washington, D.C. story, as in the White House, LBJ, Vietnam, civil rights. But partially it's also a very local D.C. story, and I'll try to get into that with some of the slides as well. In the introduction, Roberta mentioned that I had been working on Latin America for many, many years before I pivoted to writing biography. And one of the reasons I made the pivot was because I found, working in foreign policy and on Latin America specifically, that often I was the only woman in the room. And I just kind of got tired of that experience. And I really wanted to try to, I love the nodding heads. I really wanted to, can I lower this a tiny bit? It's sort of,
you can pull it out, Julia.
Okay, that's better, thank you. I wanted to try to write about women and power. And I didn't exactly know the way into that story. Very general, and but I knew that I wanted to kind of try to penetrate the boys' club of presidential historians. I had written about heads of state in Latin America, specifically Fidel Castro, and been able to use the documents in his presidential archive to kind of flip the script on the mythologies that the Cubans themselves told themselves about the way they made their revolution. So I have a historian's curiosity for archival work, and I wanted to write about that big picture theme, but didn't have a topic until the editor that I met at Random House, John Meacham, who's also a presidential historian, which is very much a male world, said, oh, you know, Lady Bird Johnson kept a diary while she was in the White House. You should check that out. And that launched, that conversation was in 2013. And I quickly went to Texas, to the LBJ Library in Austin, and unfolded this wonderful journey of discovering that Lady Bird Johnson had her own White House tapes. She kept 123 hours of tapes while she was in the White House, starting with the day of the JFK assassination and going straight through to the end of the LBJ presidency. And none of the LBJ historians had incorporated this material really to speak of at all in their accounts of the Lyndon Johnson presidency. So that was just hugely exciting to me, because the field was open and I could tell a story that actually hadn't been told using her material. And this has been just the gift that's kept on giving. You can see in this first image, Lady Bird Johnson, I don't have a pointer, but if you look, you can see those envelopes. It says Wednesday, 13 November, 1968. So this is the end of their presidency. And I say their presidency very specifically. She, at the beginning of her tenure in the White House, began a series of lunches for professional women. And the very first person she had come to speak was the woman that was the founder of what is now the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe. And that woman's name was Barbara Solomon. She was one of the founders of women's studies in the United States. And she told a room very much like this, many more women than men, almost no men then, to start documenting their lives. And she really spoke about the importance of keeping not just the ephemera of the material life of one's life, but to keep journals and diaries. And Lady Bird had already started to do that. So that's the background on a person who had really no interest in first ladies or Lady Bird Johnson, spending really a very long time with this woman and getting to know how she saw the world and how she saw herself and her husband, and the level of influence that she had in the LBJ presidency, which is pretty astonishing. So that's the background I wanted to share with you. The tapes themselves can't tell the full story. So the material in the book and the podcast that was mentioned and the documentary that's coming out on Hulu in November, and we'll see a clip of that at the end, very much relies, especially the book, on all kinds of other material, because of course these tapes for Lady Bird were a way of solidifying her legacy and her husband's legacy. They were honest. I fact-checked the hell out of her. She only made a few mistakes, but they had public consumption in mind. So you couldn't really rely entirely on just her way of telling the story to tell the story. Nevertheless, she has, and you'll hear it, a very compelling voice. It's got this gorgeous Texan swing to it. And the first thing that I will tell you, and I chose this as the second slide, is what they show is a very interesting and surprisingly modern relationship between the two Johnsons. And I like this photograph very much because it shows a bit of who has the power. These two remind me of my grandparents because they were constantly handing the phone to one another, or one would be on the phone in one room, one on the other. They were doing their business of politics together constantly. And this takes place, this photograph is just a few weeks after the assassination of JFK. They're back at the ranch, and what they are doing specifically is they're going through their call list of senior people in the American media, the head of NBC, the head of ABC, the head of CBS, because they understand that they have a very tight window in which to solidify goodwill in the country in the aftermath of the JFK assassination, when already the Kennedy family is, starting the whisper campaigns about the motives of Lyndon Johnson and the way that the first few days after the assassination unfolded. In any case, they were aware that they had a limited window, and there's a whole string of these at this moment, but I like because he's looking at her with such trust and such level of reliance and such dependence. And I heard, and I want to just insert this now, that there are a number of retired therapists here in the room. One of the things that is kind of remarkable about their story is how open Lady Bird was in recording her experience of Lyndon's depression. And his depression was a lifelong affliction. He would fall, and I don't know if we would call it bipolar disorder or you would, but it was very serious, and he would fall into very serious depressions periodically, often after major surgeries. We'll see a bit about that. And she talked about how he stretched her, how his empowering of her really demanded of her. And of course, he was demanding in many other ways, as you know, but his reliance on her, not just because of her strategic sensibility and political partnership, but for that emotional support during his depressions and to get out of them, was major. The first wonderful discovery after hearing those audio tapes or beginning to listen to them, and this is just the last two pages. This is the last two pages of what I have called the Huntland Strategy Memo. This is a 14-page handwritten document that Lady Bird wrote to Lyndon in May of 1964. Now, this was before the Great Society speech in Ann Arbor, before the first civil rights bill is passed. Vietnam is percolating, but not nearly the disaster that it was to become. And they're looking ahead to the August 1964 convention in Atlantic City and to the election that fall. And Lyndon is having major second thoughts, not just because he's depressed and he's anxious and he's thin-skinned and all of those qualities, but because he isn't really sure that after he wins, he can sustain what it will take to lead the country because of his entire personality. And so he asks Lady Bird, please set out your thoughts about this choice. And she lays it out, all of the pros, all of the cons. These are just the last 2 pages. I don't think you need to read them, but the most important part for me is the paragraph where it says, if you win, and remember that Lyndon Johnson remember what happened on March 31st, 1968? He surprised the country and told everyone he wasn't going to run. May 1964, she writes to him, if you win, let's do the best we can for 3 years and 3 or 4 months. And then the Lord letting us live that, oh shit, excuse me. Sorry guys, excuse me. The Lord letting us live that long, announce in February or March 1968 that you are not a candidate for re-election. So this really blew my socks off, because here I see, whoa, she's guiding the arc of his presidency from the jump, and also his exit from the presidency from the very beginning. This is before Bobby Kennedy announces he's going to run, before Gene McCarthy nearly beats him in New Hampshire in 1968, before major riots and uprisings around the country, and obviously before Vietnam. They're already planning their exit, and she's driving the strategy, or they're doing it together. So that I really love to see, because it framed for me her significance. The other piece of Lady Bird Johnson that reveals itself in her material, I love this photograph because she was a big outdoors woman. She needed to get away and spend a lot of time hiking without Lyndon, and she did so quite a bit, but she'd have a photographer with her and pose a little bit. She was a public persona. You think about her environmentalism, and it's called that, very kind of prissy word. We're going to go ahead. Maybe when you think about her environmentalism, you think about that version of it, beautification, which is a euphemism that concealed a much more substantive environmental agenda. She hated the word. By 1968, she started telling her staff to tell the press to stop using it. She thought Lyndon's boys were demeaning her and in her environmentalism by coming up with it and imposing it on her. What she was also about, because of course, all that beauty that we see in the springtime in Washington, D.C. is real, and she organized the money and the public consciousness raising and built a coalition to get that done. That was real. But there was another side to it in Washington, D.C., which had to do with helping to take LBJ's civil rights agenda and environmental agenda and bring it to the District of Columbia. These guys were not just Texans, they were Washingtonians, and they moved here in the 1930s when there were housing covenants keeping Blacks and Jews out in many neighborhoods, including in Northwest, including in Spring Valley. Really all over the place. Their advocacy of home rule in Washington, D.C. starts when Lyndon's in the Senate, and it continues. And I'm showing you this photograph here because she's there with Mayor Walter Washington to her left, and with Stuart Udall, the Secretary of Interior, and the guy on the far right is Lawrence Rockefeller, who was a big environmentalist. She wanted to make Washington, D.C. not just a model for ornamental environmentalism, but for bringing access to nature to the most marginalized citizens, non-voting, obviously, citizens of Washington, D.C. And she spent a lot of time with Walter Washington trying to bring to Black Washington resources that white Washington benefited from. She was a huge swimmer. She swam all the time in a really devoted way. And as you know, swimming pools are kind of a hot button issue in Washington after Brown versus Board of Education. Access to recreation for Black Washingtonians was very, very scarce. And she focused on just that. This is a photograph of her. I forgot where this is, so I wrote this down, in Northeast at the Terrace School in Anacostia. This is a neighborhood that was built in 1939 and the Supreme Court abolished the restrictive covenants in 1949, which precipitated KKK riots and a lot of violence. This was her consciousness. Her consciousness was around access to nature for Washingtonians that otherwise didn't have it compared to white Washington. This is a different vision of it. You see here with her this same posse in the other photograph. Importantly, I want to point out to you somebody, the man who's gesturing toward you with the beard, that's Lawrence Halprin. And she develops Lawrence Halprin's last major public work was the FDR Monument in Washington, D.C. For context, he's a landscape architect and a public intellectual who's was a hippie from San Francisco, from Marin County. And he developed, she with him and he with her, a very unlikely partnership. And she raised money from some civil rights philanthropists in New York to pay Halprin to develop what was called a master plan for Washington, D.C., which would, again, focused on the Anacostia and the communities
picture here. So this is this big
around the Anacostia River, not on the Potomac, not on Rock Creek Park. This is the map that is, let's see, I think this is it, Lawrence Halprin and Associates. This was published in written and developed and presented in 1968. And you can see just how elaborate it is. You can see the stadium, you can see the arboretum, you can see there's cultural center and boating lake and marina and swimming lake. Kingman Island, have any of you been to Kingman Island, to the nature preserve there? Well, Kingman Island was at risk at the time because the US Congress was going to build a highway through it. The highway story in Washington, D.C. is adjacent to this story, but Kingman Island was regarded at the time as a kind of anchor for this potential wedding of nature and civil rights and access to recreation for the residents of the area. It was saved. She had a role in that as well. But I point this out to you now because if you fast forward and think about the development along the Anacostia River, the gentrification along the Anacostia, the way that access to recreation and nature has been developed in only maybe the last 15 years, it gives you the sense of the vision that Lady Bird had with Lawrence Halprin. And that's a story that I had never seen until I found it. This is another image of her that I like very much. Also in Anacostia, this was a day when she visited Syphax Elementary School, which is now a condo, and also the Frederick Douglass Museum. This was a summer work program called Project Trailblazers. She was quite devoted to Washingtonians, and I really had no idea the extent of it. So I wanted to share that with you. But then, of course, there's the other side that's the more familiar side of Lady Bird Johnson, which has to do with Vietnam. Here, she's often the only woman in the room, and she's on the plane with McNamara and LBJ, and I'm sorry I'm having a brain freeze and I can't remember the name of the other ambassador. But this was a woman who didn't have a security clearance, but participated in many, many discussions about Vietnam. By 1968, she records in her diary that fully 2/3 of what she and Lyndon talk about is Vietnam. She starts to see early on that its corrosion of the presidency will be significant. In fact, in that memo that I showed you before, she predicts it. She says, Vietnam is going to really hurt us and prevent us from advancing our agenda. These guys were New Deal Democrats, and they thought of themselves as realizing fully FDR's vision for Washington, D.C. But she was very defensive, too, of Lyndon and of Vietnam. She felt that he was misunderstood, of course, that he had no good solution, getting out, escalating. Neither was going to end well for him, and she agreed with that. And she also had, as he did, this kind of American exceptionalism, which is, you know, in the Mekong Delta, we can do what we did in southern Texas and bring water and irrigation and education. And that's what we're about. You know, she kind of had some pretty significant blinders when it came to Vietnam. And that was also deepened, but then it shifted when her two daughters married people who were deployed to Vietnam. Chuck, of course, who was a Marine, and Pat, Lucy's husband, who was in the National Guard. I showed you this picture earlier. This was the most senior Latino member, the man she's with, of the National Park Service. His name was Ignacio Castro, but he went by Nash Castro, and never once in all of her documents did she ever acknowledge that he was Latino. I don't even know if he told her. I think he might have concealed it. I interviewed him when he was in his 90s, and he barely revealed it to me. I like this photograph here because and there's more of this in the documentary if you watch it. Lady Bird was the stage director of her tenure in the White House. She was posing, it's true, but she was also probably talking to them about the angle that they were using and the f-stop that was necessary to get the right image. She was relentless in working to advance her husband's domestic policy programs. She's probably, I think not probably, the first post-war First Lady to really marry the policy and political agenda of the Oval Office to that of the East Wing, to see that the East Wing had vast political potential for the West Wing, and she had huge fights with Lyndon's staff to get it properly staffed and, more importantly, properly funded. She was a tireless campaigner. Lyndon's people wrote him constantly and reported constantly that the best possible surrogate he could have on the campaign trail was Lady Bird Johnson. They were, you know, there are a lot of stories, and some people criticized me with this book for failing to talk about his infidelity and leaving, you know, maybe like skirting over that too much. But I decided that that had been sort of really worn to death, and that there was a lot more to say about the two of them than that. And as tight as the two of them were, there's also a very clear sense of them as separate individuals. And this photograph, to me, gives you an idea of that. They're alone, although they're together. And this is the moment when he is rehearsing his speech that he's going to give on March 31, 1968. But I'm going to come back to that in a second. But I chose this picture because it shows her participation, but in a way his isolation and the isolation of his presidency. By the end of 1967, two things happened with Lady Bird. One is she was an excellent campaigner, and her environmental agenda was growing. She goes to Williams College and to Yale in October of 1967 because she's inaugurating environmental programs, one at Williams and something else at Yale. And she's completely drowned out by anti-war protests. And this is when the bubble pops. To listen to her talk about the psychological assault of seeing that their presidency, even its environmentalism, has no platform any longer because of Vietnam, despite civil rights, despite the war on poverty. This was the time, October of 67, when she starts to actively plan for this moment of March of 1968. So one is the Vietnam War and the protests and the way it gets in the way of her vision for her environmental agenda and his. The second is the daughters going to Vietnam. That has many levels to it, but one of the things that begins to happen is that Linda, in preparing for her husband to go to Vietnam, and then while he is there, starts to invite very quietly wounded vets to come to the White House. And Lady Bird really for the first time is faced with meeting individuals who have lost one arm, two arms, both arms, one leg, limbless, terribly damaged young men. And she doesn't have the ability to cope with it. She writes about how she's left speechless. She put her hand out. Wait, that person can't shake my hand. It really undoes her, and it begins to help her, I think, also get back on the horse around campaigning for Lyndon to really get out of the White House. And she and maybe 3 or 4 other people are the only people that between the end of 67 and the end of March of 68 know that this is afoot. When he makes this speech, she's completely elated. I'm going to switch right now because I want to share with you, if I may, and we didn't talk about this in advance, what my next book is about and what I'm writing about and how I discovered it. Because one of the things that I have a passion for is finding and working on excavated archival material. And as I said, I spent the better part of 8 years in this material pertaining to Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson. And while I was doing that, I came across a woman. Now you see this is a photograph of the moment in the White House when he announces he won't run again. This is another image of a similar moment later in the evening before he goes live, but he's still rehearsing. And you see there are 2 people off to the right sitting next to Lady Bird. Well, the woman is the person I'm writing about now. And the more I started looking back in the same material I had worked in already, the more I discovered that she has this incredible story that hasn't been told. And her name is Mathilde Krim. Does that name ring a bell to any of you? So she was a major AIDS activist, and she founded AMFAR, the big AIDS medical research foundation that still exists, and that's very, very important. This is Mathilde and Lady Bird and Lyndon on Air Force One in 1960 something. I'm not sure when. Mathilde has incredible backstory, and I'll tell you it a bit, but it involves Israel, the Weizmann Institute, World War II, the Irgun, the Holocaust. She speaks 5 languages. She's the first woman to get a biology doctorate from the University of Geneva. She was on the team that discovered amniocentesis at the Weizmann Institute with the scientist Leo Sachs, who's one of the founders of Weizmann, but also the polio vaccine. And you can see, I have a lot of sympathy for her, one of the only women in the room. This is probably 1953. And she has married, oh, I'm looking to see if he's in the photograph. She married somebody who was in exile in Geneva in medical school because after going to jail several times for his actions against British Palestine in the 1930s, early 40s, his parents, who were Bulgarian Zionist doctors in Tel Aviv, negotiated a deal with the Brits to get their son out on condition that he wouldn't come back. So he goes to Geneva and meets Mathilde, and Mathilde and David fall in love and they marry. She converts to Judaism with these Orthodox rabbis in Geneva, and they move to Israel. The story of Mathilde Krim, way before she gets to Washington and takes on Reagan and Tony Fauci, is a really fascinating one, and I'm deep in it right now. But thankfully, it's from the Johnsons that I learned about her. She and her husband, Arthur Krim, Arthur was the founder of United Artists, not the founder, excuse me, but he was the chairman of United Artists, the huge movie company credited with, I don't know, maybe 50 Academy Awards, the James Bond franchise, the Beatles movies. One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest, United Artists became Orion, very, very big guy. And he was the Democratic Party chair and finance chair for the party for Adlai Stevenson, JFK, and LBJ, and then for Carter too. So she had divorced her husband in Israel, was a single mom in Israel in the 1950s, and meets Arthur Krim, who's a trustee of Weitzman. She moves to New York, and then the rest really is a history that I won't share with you. But I had to share this. This is Mathilde now in the 1990s at the Gay Pride Parade with Mr. Leather. Arthur had died in 1994, and she went on to use all of her philanthropic and political and Hollywood ties to raise the profile of AIDS in Washington and across the country. This is an Annie Leibovitz portrait of her. But it's relevant to us today here at Temple Micah and with the holidays coming up, because Matilda Krim wasn't always a Jew. She was a Calvinist. And what happened to her as a 20-something during World War II was that her parents completely sheltered her from what was happening under the Nazi regime in the camps. And she tells this story of her awakening after the war, going to the movies, seeing a newsreel of the camps and of the survivors and of the bodies, and being completely horrified that her parents hadn't told her anything. She describes her parents as passive anti-Semites, and she says she was drawn to David, the first husband, in a way, for many different reasons. But when she married him, it was obviously a huge earthquake in her family. And, she was a secular Jew all of her life, but the blinders and the denial that she was subject to haunted her so much that she talked about that being the primary motivation, for her taking on AIDS at a time when nobody else was really talking about AIDS, because she wanted to fight stigma and make sure that the people that were victims of the disease would not be further victimized by the bias coming out of the White House. And that's a mild term for it. So I'm sharing, David, I think I need your help, because in touching these buttons, I've screwed this up. So Mathilde Krim is the subject of my next biography. A lot of people called her Matilda. You can do either, but it is Mathilde. And that'll come out whenever I finish it. I want to share with you, to wrap up before I take your questions. I'll let him do his work. So I mentioned Lady Bird's huge audio trove really lends itself to multimedia, not just book. We produced an 8-episode podcast, which is an audio documentary that's produced by ABC News that I host, and now we have coming up. I'm going to take a poll because I know you might be losing interest. We have coming up I can show you 2 clips from the documentary. One is the trailer and one is an excerpt. One is about 1 minute long and one is about 2 minutes long. Do you want to see the short one, the long one, or both? Okay. All right, I'm going to start with this one. Hopefully, don't go too far. I want to, so you're going to get to hear her voice, and I've been instructed to hold this microphone to this audio. So, there we go.
I walked into the room to find Abe sitting quietly by Lemon's bedside. I was seeking Abe's advice on how he could escape from the burdens of the presidency for the next...
Can't hear.
...definite period. So here is the black beast of depression back in our lives. He was like a man on whom an avalanche had suddenly fallen. He said he didn't feel like making a single decision right now. I want to go to the ranch. I don't want Hubert to be even able to call me. They may demand that I resign. They may even want to impeach me. Mostly we sat in an atmosphere of numbed silence, with Abe offering quiet legal observations on the alternatives. Abe began to write out what Lyndon had asked him to. And after Lyndon read it, he said, "Here, you'd better keep both these copies. I don't want anybody to know about them." I think it quite essential that he have days, maybe weeks of rest. But how to buy a little time of quiet when you are President of the United States?
So you heard her talking about Abe Fortas, and he was on the Supreme Court.
Can't hear.
Sorry.
Hold
In
on.
October of 1965, Lyndon had his first gallbladder surgery, and that precipitated a major, major depression. What she's describing is coming from the White House to Bethesda Naval Hospital and finding Abe in the room and Lyndon dictating a resignation speech. I should have said at the beginning, but for historiographical and territorial purposes, I'll just tell you that we broke news with this because, again, because it was in Lady Bird's diaries and not in Lyndon's diaries or documents or tapes, just ignored. And this is pretty significant in my view, that over and over, and there are probably times when it happened that she didn't record it, she's coaching him back into the Oval Office. So now we can show the next one. Now, what I'm going to show you now is the trailer that just came out today. I think it's the 2-minute long trailer, which gives you a sense of the documentary film.
Friday, November 22nd. It all began so beautifully. After a drizzling morning, the sun came out bright and beautiful.
Make it louder.
We were going into Dallas.
We have a brilliant sun overhead, and the president will be riding in the open. The wheels are down, and the president and Mrs. Kennedy have arrived at Dallas Love Field. To accompany the president on these flights, Vice President and Mrs. Johnson.
In the lead car, President, Mrs. Kennedy, and then a Secret Service car, and then our car. Streets were lined with people, lots and lots of children, all smiling. We were rounding a curve, going down a hill. Suddenly, there was a sharp, loud report. A shot, and then two more. I heard over the radio system, "Let's get out of here." And this man who was with us vaulted over the front seat on top of Lyndon, threw him to the floor, and said, "Get down." Cars accelerated faster and faster. I cast one last look back over my shoulder, saw a bundle of pink, it's like a drift blossom lying in the back seat. It was Mrs. Kennedy lying over the president's body. They led us into a quiet room. It was from Kenny O'Donnell that I first heard the words, "The president is dead."
Well, that's just the Kennedy assassination part. Sorry, guys.
Try this new smart patch instead. It draws out
That's not the full trailer. That's just the taste of the beginning. I apologize, but you get a sense of.
the most bizarre way possible. When we saw it on Facebook, we thought it was bullshit.
I just
We done
put it to sleep. I don't think we need anything more. I think that's fine. We can just. In any case, you got a sense. You got to hear her, and you got to hear her narrating one of the most consequential events in American history that changed her life, obviously. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.